Insulin resistance is one of the key elements which underscores your development of the zone diet. Can you talk to us about this and what prompted you to come up with the zone diet? What, almost 30 years ago now at this stage?
Well, actually, it began even earlier than that. It began in 1982 with the Nobel Prize in Medicine, which was awarded for understanding how a group of hormones called eicosanoids drive inflammation. And we now know that inflammation is the underlying cause of virtually every chronic disease. So it became obvious to me that one of the key factors going forward in treating chronic disease in the future was to decrease systemic inflammation in each of our organs and also each of our 30 trillion cells. So I set out on a really kind of a journey to understand how to do that. And it became quite apparent that one of the key factors that drives inflammation is actually excess insulin. And the reason why, because it basically produces more of the building block of the eicosanoids that are the most powerful inflammatory agents we know. So the key to the problem is twofold: to reduce the levels of inflammation systemically and to reduce hyperinsulinemia at the same time. Well, to reduce the levels of inflammation, one can use omega-3 fatty acids, but they work only in very high concentrations. On the other hand, if you can reduce hyperinsulinemia by the diet, that also has a dramatic impact on reducing inflammation. And when you combine the two together, they become exceptionally synergistic. So it has been really close to a 40-year journey to understand, going back to 2,500 years ago, when Hippocrates said, "Let food be your medicine, will let medicine be your food." We now know, through understanding more of the mysteries of metabolism, is that our diet becomes that tool that we can now control systemic inflammation in every organ in the body if we choose to.
And systemic inflammation really has at its heart, it's an inflammatory and it's an immune response within the body. And this is the body's overreacting to what you're putting into the body as such.
Actually, it's even more complex than that. There's two parts of inflammation. You've got to turn it on and you got to turn it off. Now, if we had no inflammation, we'd be a sitting duck. Our physical injuries would never heal. We'd be basically unable to fight off microbial infections. So we need a robust pro-inflammatory, acute inflammatory response to address the damage. But then we need to turn off the inflammation. That comes from a different group of hormones. They're called resolvins. And they're basically made by the substrates are the omega-3 fatty acids. So if you don't have enough omega-3 fatty acids in your diet, then you're going to have a problem of basically having an insufficiency of the ability to turn off inflammation. But that's putting all your eggs in one basket. And that's why now the hyperinsulinemia and insulin resistance becomes another key factor. Because insulin resistance can be viewed as a marker of a disrupted metabolism. And it's our metabolism that basically controls also other inflammatory mediators like cytokines. So basically that you need to control the diet to control insulin and have the adequate levels of omega-3 fatty acids. So you now have a 1-2 punch to keep inflammation in a zone. Not too high, but not too low. And so the derivation of the zone diet was basically a diet. Really, it was developed and patented as a drug to treat hyperinsulinemia. And for what purpose? To keep inflammation in a zone that would give rise to a longer and better life.
What does the makeup of that zone diet look like? What kind of proportion of macronutrients are we talking about? Carbohydrates, proteins, and fats, etc.
Well, let's talk about the one part of the zone diet nobody wants to hear. It's a calorie-restricted diet. Oh no, I want to eat. Say, it doesn't work that way. You basically have to restrict calories, but you have to restrict them without hunger and fatigue. Now that becomes a little more complex. So in most diet aspects, we have biohacker say, I take out macronutrient X, and that solves all the problems. Metabolism doesn't work that way. Metabolism is more like a soundboard in a radio studio, a recording studio, where the sound engineer is moving the signals back and forth to get the precise aspect. So what you're looking for is basically, I need to have adequate protein at every meal. And why? Because I have to shut down hunger. And that's exactly how drugs like Ozempic work. They basically give rise to basically the hormones that basically go directly to the brain and say, stop eating. So if you're always hungry, you're not going to be able to restrict calories. So how much protein do you need? It's about 30 grams at each meal. And put that in perspective, that's about the amount you can put on the palm of your hand. But I said at every meal, because this is the drug, and we've shown at Harvard Medical School that the hormonal responses only last about 5 hours. So it says every 5 hours, your number one goal is getting 30 grams of protein, not more, but not less, into your diet. Okay, what's next? Add some carbohydrates. Well, how much? Well, not much more, maybe 40 grams. But what types? You really want to have those which have a very low glycemic index. Which are those? The ones your grandmother told you to eat. Your vegetables. What did she know? She knew everything. She was right on the cutting edge of basically hormonal modulation. So by eating basically about 40 grams of low glycemic carbohydrates with that 30 grams of protein, you're going to get a good balance of basically insulin and glucagon. That stabilizes blood sugar levels. Well, what about fat? You add a dash. Okay, what's a dash? Okay, it could be a tablespoon of extra virgin olive oil. It could be of, a half an ounce of almonds or 2 tablespoons of guacamole. That's it. What you've done now is basically develop a drug that for the next 5 hours will basically give rise to hormonal balance, not only in the blood, but in the interior of the cell. And by doing so, you have now stabilized and made the metabolism more efficient. And the secret is doing that every meal the best you can the rest of your life. I said, no, it's boring. I'll just basically take a drug. It's easier, but drugs do have things called side effects. And they do have some other ancillary aspects which are not that desirable. But it's only with the new understanding of the mysteries of metabolism that we can see how powerful food is if you treat it as if it were a drug, be taken at the right dosage at the right time.
One of the key elements of what you've said there, then, for me, certainly is taking regular protein with every meal controls the satiety and prevents you from going on a binge whereby you're trying to feed yourself as many carbs as possible. Would that be correct?
Exactly. And everything really starts at the hypothalamus in the brain. It's getting inputs throughout the body, and it's making its best decisions based on the inputs it's getting. So that if you can maintain that balance of protein to carbohydrate in the diet, now you can basically affect the hypothalamus not only by the hormones in the blood, but directly through the vagal nerve. This is the nerve system that's directly connected to our gut. That becomes a gut-brain connection. So now our diet basically not only affects hormones in the blood, but can now basically transmit hormonal signals through the vagal nerve directly to the brain and saying, stop eating. And if you're not hungry, guess what? You lose weight. Well, not necessarily. Like I'll use Wegovy as an example, the new GLP-1 receptor agonist drugs. You do lose weight, no question about it. But about 40% of the weight loss is lean body mass. What's lean body mass? Things like muscle, liver, kidney, heart, brain. These are things you don't want to lose. You're not hungry, but you're not getting in adequate protein to stimulate gene transcription factors in the cells that basically replenish damaged cells. We're losing cells on a second-by-second basis, and we have to replace them if we maintain homeostasis in the body.
You mentioned vegetables there a couple of moments ago. Could we make the distinction between starchy and non-starchy vegetables, and which are good for us and which aren't?
Well, the ones are what best ones are the non-starchy vegetables. And so which one of those? Here's an easy way to remember. The A, B, C's. Asparagus, artichoke hearts, broccoli, cauliflower, spinach. What about the other ones? Well, they're really very rich in carbohydrates, so it's very easy to overconsume them. And by the time you get now to fruits and grains, basically it's incredibly easy to overconsume. So again, if we're looking at basically, and also by restricting calories, we want to make sure we have the maximum nutrients coming in from the carbohydrates. And that's why the non-starchy vegetables, again, come out a winner in that respect.
Could you tell me what's happening in the body whenever we reach for crackers or bread? Because I'm sure everybody is familiar with being able to eat an entire loaf of bread in one sitting. You never get full eating carbohydrates like that. What's happening there?
Well, there's two parts. One of the reasons why you basically go after the carbohydrates, because again, the initial carbohydrate load you were eating it in the first place has been now raising insulin that drives blood sugar levels down. That's a stress signal to the brain. Second aspect, the carbohydrates, the faster they enter into the hypothalamus, affect basically now our receptors in the brain that basically are hedonically, basically the same ones that you get affected by basically drug addiction. So basically, this will make me feel good. So you get now a reward response. So again, when we look at addictive behavior, it could be alcoholism, drug abuse, or carbohydrate abuse. They are basically ways our brain metabolism is being compromised by our diet or other exogenous materials in our body. But again, you can go to have a very large meal at a restaurant and then say, "Oh, I'm stuffed," but you always have room for dessert. So it's a complete abolition of the laws of matter. Say, wait, you're stuffed. If I really want that dessert, those are the hedonic urges now kicking in.
That's so true. That's so true. And it has always been the case since I was a child. I always have enough for dessert. I think everybody can relate to that.
So again, that's why that we've given nutrition or really diet really the short shrift. Say, there'll be some magic elixir, or there's some conspiracy by the drug companies to hide all the facts from us. The fact is, we didn't have the knowledge of how complex metabolism is. Now that we do, we can stand back in greater awe, say what the potential is. It's not to say that diet's going to replace drugs. If you have a chronic disease, there'll always be a role for drugs to treat the symptoms. But the more you control the diet, the less drug you need. You're making the drugs work better at lower concentrations. And so we have to really kind of begin to look at this hackneyed word that's used quite a bit, wellness, and say, what's wellness? Say, I'm well. Say, sorry, that doesn't quite cut it. So we need a good marker, a good blood marker that says, are you well or not? Now, I think the best blood marker turns out to be what's called HOMA-IR. It's a measure of insulin resistance. Now, even there we have a problem in terms of interpretation. When we talk about insulin resistance, it says, our insulin just is interacting with receptors. That's only half the aspect. Insulin resistance can be defined as the inability to remove glucose from the blood. And your cells, which are insulin sensitive, have two ways of doing that. One, to use insulin to activate the receptor to basically bring the protein to the cell's surface called GLUT4 to pull glucose out of the blood. But there's a second mechanism. It basically is controlled by the master regulator of metabolism in each of your 30 trillion cells. It's called AMPK. And AMPK, if it's activated, will also send that same GLUT4 protein to the cell surface to bring in glucose. Now, how do you basically activate AMPK? Well, one is, I can exercise. Are you going to exercise 24/7? Highly unlikely. Now, second way, restrict calories. That's about much more powerful. So this is why calorie restriction becomes so important, because you now have an ability to basically activate AMPK and begin to reprogram your metabolism, not only in terms of better blood sugar control, but in better inflammatory control. Because of AMPK also decreases the production of cytokines in the cell. And so the more you activate AMPK, the more you're able to control systemic inflammation in every organ of the body. Now, that being said, can you activate it too much? Yes, you can. Remember, those cells, basically, we're losing cells, millions of cells per second. We have to replace them. And there's a gene transcription factor in every cell called mTOR. And if AMPK goes up, mTOR goes down. If mTOR goes up, AMP goes down. So you have a problem with taking a drug approach. I'll push one up or down, but there's going to be a counterbalance that's going to cause disruption. So this is why now protein becomes so important in the zone diet, because protein activates mTOR. You need some, but not too much. So you're looking again now to get a balance not only of carbohydrate, but a balance of the activity of mTOR and AMPK in every one of your 30 trillion cells.
Talking of inflammation, you've mentioned it a couple of times so far. What is the relationship between inflammation and depression?
Well, we think depression is being a deficiency in Prozac. It's not quite that simple. About 40% of the people who basically take drugs like Prozac really have no benefits. We now know that inflammation is also a neuroinflammatory disease. So, if that being the case, then fish oil, omega-3 fatty acids, should be useful. Well, they are, but at very high concentrations. The first study was published at Harvard in 1999, when they used 10 grams a day of omega-3 fatty acids in bipolar patients. They had to stop the study after 3 months. Why? The differences between the active and the placebo group were so great, it became unethical to continue. We've done studies, again, in children with a major depressive disorder at a dose-response curve. At 2.5 grams, you see some benefits, but not great, not statistically significant. Remember, at 2.5 grams of omega-3 fatty acids, the average of individual in the U.S. and the UK consume about 100 milligrams per day. So 2.5 grams is quite a bit higher than the average levels consumed. But once you went to 16 grams per day, all of a sudden you saw these dramatic improvements in depression. And we also know that depression, when you're using high levels of omega-3 fatty acids, the results are highly correlated with the levels of these hormones called resolvins. As they basically are increased in their production, the levels of depression goes down dramatically. So again, when fighting depression, you're fighting a disease with one hand tied behind your back using things like Prozac. Okay, there's a benefit of basically looking to increase certain neurotransmitters, but unless you're controlling neuroinflammation at the same time, you're fighting a losing battle.
Would love to hear your thoughts on something like the carnivore diet, for example, which practically excludes all carbohydrates in favor of meat products and high levels of fat. What are your thoughts on this diet?
Well, this is one of the reasons why you don't read the internet. It basically makes no sense. It makes no sense biochemically because you need basically a balance. The primary fuel, the primary fuel the brain works on, regardless of what you hear in the literature, is glucose. And this is why basically you have to have enough carbohydrates to maintain blood sugar levels so that basically the brain can work at peak efficiency. Now, this is the aspect of the carnivore diet is just the extreme of the keto diet. They say, yeah, we no need for those stinky carbohydrates. We'll basically have fats and protein. The carnivore diet, this takes it to the extreme. So what you have there is that becomes a stress situation for the brain, because as blood sugar levels drop, the brain sends out an emergency signal, the hormone cortisol, to start the breakdown of muscle into glucose for the brain. And this is why in starvation studies, where basically for 35 days, these were published at Harvard also back in the 60s, on a total fast, even though they were eating no food whatsoever, their blood sugar levels never dropped below 65 milligrams per deciliter, even at day 35. Now, if they went to day 50, they would be dead. So that's why they stopped it. But how can you basically have nothing coming to the body and still have blood sugar? Because of extensive, gluconeogenesis. So again, the carnivore diet is saying, this is your, area where biohackers basically reign supreme, saying, trust me, look at my abs. I've got a 10-pack. I say, yeah, but, what type of damage are you doing? So again, we go back to that analogy of the sound studio. Basically, you need to have that consistent balance, the main hormonal and epigenetic balance in the body. Otherwise, basically, bad things are in the horizon.
A lot of people at the moment seem to be struggling with digestive issues, be it acid reflux or bloating. Can symptoms like this be addressed by looking at food intake and describing just something like the zone diet?
They can. There's two parts about the gut that we tend to overlook. One, it's basically, yes, the microbes in the gut, but it's the inflammation of the cells that line the gut. And so those are where basically our issues come from. It's inflammation in the gut. Well, inflammation is inflammation, whether it's in the gut, the blood vessels, the brain, the kidney, it doesn't matter. So again, the same type of diet I've talked about, again, with adequate levels of omega-3 fatty acids, a calorie-restricted diet that basically maintains hormonal balance, is your best aspect of reducing inflammation in your gut cells. Now, say, what about the microbes? Well, there's about 1 trillion microbes, if not more, on the face of the earth. But somehow, over evolution, only 1,500 have been chosen to occupy our gut. And this is why our immune system basically ignores them. So those microbes say, well, I'll use, probiotics. Well, probiotics are basically almost like target practice for the immune system in the gut walls. They're not going to be implanted. They'll just pass it through, but they're relatively benign. So basically, they sharpen up their immunological skills. So when a really nasty pathogen comes in there, they can take care of it. However, if that gut wall is somehow compromised by inflammation, then basically more pathological microbes can more likely enter in the blood and cause a metabolic endotoxemia. And so we have to say, yes, we want to make sure we can maintain the levels of the chosen microbes that we basically have learned to basically be compatible with, because they're our first lines of defense. But at the same time, we have to work and make sure we have little inflammation in our troops that line the gut wall interface. And this is why 70% of your immune system is located in the gut. That's the most likely first attack from an outside invader.
Now, you've made a promotion code Healthy10 available for people who want to find out more about that code and find out more about how they can use it in order to avail of your diet, your zone diet. Where can they go online to find out?
Well, we have two websites. One is called zoneliving.com. It talks about, here's the way to basically use your diet and basically to adjust it and really personalize it to your biochemistry. And they want more information. I recommend my website, drsears.com, that goes into far greater detail of perhaps too much great detail, but nonetheless, people want to have knowledge of basically how important our metabolism is to controlling our future.
Terrific. Well, great to talk to you today, Dr. Barry Sears. We'll pop a link to those two websites in the show notes for this episode, plus that Healthy10 promo code. that you very generously provided. But for the moment, thank you so much for joining me on the podcast today. Really appreciate your time.
Thank you for the opportunity.
Well, thank you for tuning into this episode of the Happy Habit Podcast. If you enjoyed it or any of the previous 400 plus episodes, well, then show your support. It's free. You can like, subscribe, share with other people who you think might enjoy these episodes too. You can leave the podcast a positive rating on iTunes or on Spotify. And if you're over on YouTube, you can become a subscriber over there too. Leave a comment and click that bell notification for any future videos. Until next time, stay happy.